Sarah passed away in 2018 from cancer. Their children, now adults with families of their own, lived in different states and called every few weeks. Edwin found himself alone in the house that had once been filled with laughter and love, surrounded by 40-year-old memories and a Medal of Honor he kept hidden in a shoebox in the basement. That's when he applied for the janitor position at Lincoln High School. The pay was minimal, the work was hard, but it gave him purpose. More importantly, it let him protect something precious, the future. Edwin's job interview had been brief. Principal Elizabeth Hayes, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, had reviewed his application with some confusion. "Mr. Torres, your resume shows military service and 20 years in construction management. You're overqualified for a custodial position. Why do you want this job?" Edwin had considered his words carefully. "Ma'am, I've spent my whole life building things and protecting people. This would let me do both." She hired him on the spot. What Principal Hayes didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Edwin Torres had studied every mass shooting incident since Columbine. He knew the timeline, the tactics, the failures in response. After Sandy Hook, when 20 children and 6 adults were murdered in their own classrooms, Edwin had made a promise to himself. Never again. Not on his watch. His daily routine at Lincoln High wasn't random. Edwin cleaned the second floor first because it provided the best sight lines to all entrances. He checked every door lock, not because they might be broken, but because he needed to know which rooms could be secured quickly. He memorized class schedules so he knew exactly where every student would be at any given time. In his janitor's closet, behind the industrial cleaning supplies and spare light bulbs, Edwin kept a small metal lockbox. Inside were his emergency plans, detailed floor layouts with tactical annotations, and his Vietnam service radio, still functional after 50 years. He also kept something else, a loaded Glock 19, legally carried with a concealed permit that few people knew existed. The students at Lincoln High saw only what Edwin wanted them to see, a quiet, hard-working janitor who kept their school clean and occasionally smiled when they said good morning. They called him Uncle Edwin because he reminded them of everyone's grandfather, harmless, invisible, part of the background. 16-year-old Jessica Martinez was one of the few students who actually paid attention to Edwin. She'd noticed how he always seemed to know when someone was having a bad day, how he would quietly place a fresh box of tissues in a classroom where a girl had been crying, how he somehow always showed up when bullying was happening in empty hallways. "My dad says you can tell a lot about a person by how they treat people who can't do anything for them," Jessica had told her friend Katie one afternoon as they watched Edwin carefully cleaning graffiti off a bathroom wall. Uncle Edwin treats everyone like they matter, but Jessica, like everyone else, had no idea that Edwin treated everyone with respect because he understood the value of human life in ways that most people, thankfully, never would. Marcus Davidson was 19 years old and shouldn't have been anywhere near Lincoln High School. He dropped out as a sophomore, spent 2 years drifting between minimum wage jobs and his mother's basement, and had slowly descended into the dark corners of the internet where anger and isolation fermented into something dangerous. Marcus had been a quiet kid in school, neither popular nor bullied, just invisible. After dropping out, that invisibility had turned into resentment. He spent his days on forums where other angry young men fed each other's rage, where violence was glorified and innocence was despised. For 3 months, Marcus had been planning what he called his moment of recognition. He'd studied other school shooters, researched their methods, their failures, their body counts. He'd chosen Lincoln High because it was close to his house and because he remembered being ignored there. On the morning of November 15th, Marcus Davidson loaded his father's AR-15 into a duffel bag, along with 4 loaded magazines and a handwritten manifesto that blamed everyone except himself for his failures. He drove to Lincoln High School with every intention of becoming infamous. At 10:47 a.m., Marcus walked through the main entrance of Lincoln High School. The security guard, a part-time retiree named Bob Mitchell, was at his desk reviewing the morning's visitor log. Marcus nodded politely as he passed. Just another young man who might be a substitute teacher or a maintenance contractor. Marcus made it 20 feet into the building before he pulled out the rifle. The first shot shattered the morning quiet and sent students in the main hallway scrambling for cover. Marcus methodically began moving toward the classroom wing, firing randomly into lockers and bulletin boards as panicked teenagers fled in all directions. Edwin Torres was on the 3rd floor, mopping the hallway outside room 312, when he heard the unmistakable crack of an AR-15. The sound transported him instantly back to Vietnam. His body reacted before his mind fully processed what was happening. The mop clattered to the floor as Edwin reached for the emergency radio clipped to his belt. His voice, when he spoke, carried the calm authority of a man who had been in life or death situations before. "Main office, this is Edwin. Code red, active shooter, main entrance, single shooter with rifle. Initiate lockdown protocol immediately." "I'm responding." Amanda Wright, the school secretary, barely had time to process Edwin's words before she was reaching for the PA system microphone. Throughout the building, the lockdown alarm began to wail, a sound every student and teacher had practiced but prayed they'd never hear for real. Edwin was already moving. He pulled the small key from around his neck and unlocked his supply closet. The metal lockbox opened with muscle memory, and Edwin quickly pocketed his radio and checked his sidearm. 52 years after Vietnam, Edwin Torres was going back to war. But this wasn't a jungle in Southeast Asia. This was an American high school filled with children who had never heard gunfire except in movies. As Edwin moved through the hallways, he could hear teachers frantically locking doors and students crying in terror. The weight of their lives settled on his shoulders, like the old pack he'd carried through the Vietnamese highlands. Edwin reached the main stairwell and paused to assess the situation. Through the small window in the stairwell door, he could see Marcus moving methodically down the main hallway, firing into classroom doors. The young man was trying to breach the locked doors, but hadn't yet succeeded. Edwin had maybe 3 minutes before Marcus figured out how to get into the rooms where students were hiding. Moving with the silent precision he'd learned in jungle warfare, Edwin descended to the first floor. He could hear Marcus's heavy breathing and muttered curses as the young man became frustrated with his inability to break down the reinforced classroom doors. Edwin took position at the corner of the hallway, 30 feet from Marcus's position. Everything he'd learned in Vietnam came flooding back: breathing control, sight alignment, the critical importance of stopping a threat without risking civilian casualties. "Marcus," Edwin's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The young shooter spun around, rifle raised, eyes wild with adrenaline and confusion. He saw an old janitor in work clothes, standing calmly in the middle of the hallway. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with stress. "My name is Edwin Torres," Edwin replied, his voice steady as granite. "I'm the custodian here. I need you to put down the weapon, son." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the lockers. "You're just some old man. Get out of my way, or I'll kill you too." Edwin took a small step forward. "Marcus, I know you're angry. I know you feel like nobody sees you, nobody cares. But this isn't going to fix that. This is only going to make things worse." "You don't know anything about me," Marcus shouted, waving the rifle erratically. "I know you're in pain," Edwin said quietly. "I know you feel like the world has forgotten you. I felt the same way when I came back from Vietnam. But hurting innocent people won't heal that pain. It'll only create more." For a moment, Marcus hesitated. Something in the old man's voice was different from what he'd expected. This wasn't fear or anger. This was understanding. "You were in Vietnam?" Marcus asked, his voice suddenly younger, more uncertain. "4 tours," Edwin nodded. "Saw things that still wake me up at night. Lost friends who were barely older than you. Came home to a country that didn't want to hear about what we'd been through." Marcus's grip on the rifle loosened slightly. "Then you know what it's like, being invisible, being ignored." "I do," Edwin agreed. "But I also know that taking innocent lives won't make you visible. It'll just make you a monster. And you're not a monster, Marcus. You're a young man who's lost his way." For 30 seconds, the two men stared at each other across the hallway. In those 30 seconds, Edwin saw not a mass shooter, but a broken child who had never learned how to handle pain without inflicting it on others. Then Marcus raised the rifle again. "It's too late. I've already started this." "It's never too late to stop," Edwin said. "Not until you pull that trigger again." Marcus's finger moved toward the trigger, and Edwin knew he was out of time for talking. What happened next took 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Edwin moved with the fluid precision of a man who had survived close-quarters combat in the world's most dangerous places. He covered the distance between himself and Marcus in 2 quick steps, using the combat techniques he'd learned 50 years ago and never forgotten. Edwin's left hand swept the rifle barrel aside just as Marcus fired, sending the shot harmlessly into the ceiling. His right hand struck Marcus's wrist with just enough force to make him release the weapon. Before Marcus could react, Edwin had the young man on the ground in a submission hold that immobilized him without causing serious injury. "It's over," Edwin said quietly, as Marcus struggled beneath him. "You're not going to hurt anyone today." The entire confrontation, from first words to final takedown, had lasted less than 4 minutes. When the first police officers arrived at Lincoln High School 8 minutes later, they found Edwin Torres sitting calmly next to a subdued Marcus Davidson. The rifle was unloaded and secured 20 feet away. Marcus was conscious but restrained, muttering apologies through his tears. Officer Sarah Chen, a 15-year veteran of the force, approached cautiously with her weapon drawn. She'd responded to enough domestic disputes and drug busts to recognize when a situation was truly under control. But she'd never seen anything quite like this. "Sir, I'm going to need you to identify yourself and explain what happened here," she said, keeping her service weapon trained on the two men. Edwin slowly reached into his back pocket and produced his wallet. "My name is Edwin Torres. I work here as a custodian." This young man entered the building with a rifle and was firing at classrooms. I was able to disarm him without anyone being hurt. Officer Chen examined Edwin's identification, then radioed for additional backup and medical personnel. As she processed the scene, something nagged at her. The way the old man had positioned himself, the calm precision with which he'd controlled the situation, the tactical awareness he displayed, this wasn't the response of a typical civilian. "Mr. Torres, do you have any military or law enforcement background?" Edwin hesitated for just a moment. "Vietnam veteran, ma'am. 1st Infantry Division." Officer Chen nodded, but she had a feeling there was more to the story. When backup arrived and she could properly secure the scene, she made a note to run a more thorough background check on Edwin Torres. As paramedics checked Marcus for injuries and other officers began processing the scene, students and teachers started emerging from their locked classrooms. The looks on their faces as they saw Edwin, quiet, invisible Uncle Edwin, standing over the disarmed shooter, would be burned into their memories forever. Jessica Martinez was among the first students to emerge from room 115, where she'd been hiding under a desk for 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. When she saw Edwin standing in the hallway, his custodian uniform torn and his face calm despite everything that had just happened, she started crying. "Uncle Edwin," she whispered, then louder. "Uncle Edwin stopped him. Uncle Edwin saved us." Word spread through the building faster than the all-clear announcement. Edwin Torres, the janitor they barely noticed, had single-handedly stopped a mass shooting. But none of them, not the students, not the teachers, not even the police, knew the full story yet. That evening, Officer Chen ran Edwin's name through the military database as part of her incident report. What she found made her sit back in her chair and reach for her phone to call her captain. "Captain, you need to see this. The janitor who stopped the shooter today. He's not just any Vietnam vet. He's Congressional Medal of Honor." The database file that came up was mostly classified, but the basic facts were enough to paint a picture that explained everything Chen had witnessed. Edwin Torres hadn't just served in Vietnam. He'd been one of the war's most decorated heroes. The same hands that had disarmed Marcus Davidson had once held off an entire enemy company for 6 hours to save his squad. Within hours, the story began to spread beyond Lincoln High School. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets, then national media. But the reporters who called Edwin's home got only his answering machine, and the man himself seemed to have vanished. Edwin had gone home after giving his statement to police, fed his elderly dog Rex, and sat in his living room, staring at the box of commendations he'd kept hidden in his basement for decades. For the first time in 50 years, he wondered if maybe it was time to let people know who he really was. The next morning, Edwin arrived at Lincoln High School at his usual 6:30 a.m. to find a crowd of people waiting for him. Students, parents, teachers, reporters, and random community members had gathered in the parking lot. As soon as they saw his pickup truck, they began applauding. Edwin sat in his truck for a moment, overwhelmed by the attention he'd spent his entire adult life avoiding. Then he remembered something his squad leader had told him in Vietnam. Sometimes being a hero means being seen, not just being brave. He got out of the truck and walked toward the crowd. The applause grew louder, and several students broke away from the group to hug him. Jessica Martinez was the first to reach him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for protecting us." Principal Hayes appeared next to him, her own eyes red with emotion. "Mr. Torres, I think we need to talk." The conversation that followed in Principal Hayes' office was one that Edwin had been avoiding for 50 years. She'd done her own research overnight and knew exactly who she'd been employing as a janitor. The Congressional Medal of Honor was just the beginning. Edwin's classified service record. What little she could access, read like something from a war movie. "Edwin, why didn't you tell us?" she asked. "Do you know what an honor it's been to have you here?" Edwin considered his words carefully, as he always did. "Ma'am, I didn't come here to be honored. I came here to serve. The children in this building don't need to know what I did 50 years ago. They just need to know they're safe. But they do know now," Principal Hayes said gently. "And they understand that safety comes from people like you, people who are willing to put others before themselves." Over the next week, Lincoln High School was transformed. Students who had previously ignored Edwin now stopped to shake his hand and thank him. Teachers who had barely acknowledged his presence began striking up conversations. Parents who had never known his name sent letters and flowers. But perhaps the most significant change was in the students themselves. Marcus Davidson's attempted attack had been stopped, not by police or security guards or metal detectors, but by an ordinary man who had chosen to be extraordinary when it mattered most. Senior class president Michael Thompson organized a school assembly to honor Edwin. At first, Edwin declined to attend, preferring to let the spotlight fall on others. But when Jessica Martinez personally asked him to come, explaining that the students needed to hear his story, he reluctantly agreed. The assembly was held in the gymnasium, with all 1,200 students and the entire faculty in attendance. Local news cameras were there, as were several military veterans from the community who had heard about Edwin's story. When Principal Hayes introduced Edwin, the applause was thunderous. He walked slowly to the podium, still wearing his custodian uniform, still carrying himself with the quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. "Students of Lincoln High," Edwin began, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium's sound system. "I've been honored to work in your school for 3 years. I've watched you grow, learn, and become the future leaders of our community." He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces. Faces that could have been casualties if events had gone differently just 1 week earlier. What happened last Tuesday wasn't about heroism. It was about responsibility. Every adult in this building has a responsibility to protect you, to give you the chance to grow up and make your mark on the world. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. A student in the front row raised her hand. "Mr. Torres, why did you become a janitor when you could have done anything?" Edwin smiled, the first genuine smile many of them had ever seen from him. "Because sometimes the most important jobs are the ones that nobody notices. For 3 years, I've had the privilege of keeping your school clean and safe. That's not a small thing. Your education, your safety, your future, those are the most important things in the world." Another student asked, "Were you scared when you confronted the shooter?" Edwin's expression grew more serious. "Yes. Fear is normal. Fear keeps you alive. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear to protect something more important than yourself." The questions continued for 30 minutes. Edwin answered each one thoughtfully, never boasting about his military service, never making himself the center of attention. Instead, he used each question as an opportunity to teach about service, about responsibility, about the value of every single life in that gymnasium. As the assembly concluded, something unexpected happened. Without any prompting from teachers or administrators, the entire student body rose and began applauding. But this wasn't the polite applause of a school assembly. This was the grateful recognition of 1,200 young people who understood that their lives had been saved by a man who asked for nothing in return. Edwin Torres stood at that podium, looking out at the faces of the children he'd protected, and for the first time in 50 years, he felt like he'd truly come home from war. After the assembly, Edwin returned to his custodial duties. He still arrived at 6:30 a.m., still cleaned the hallways, still checked the doors. But now, students stopped to talk with him. Teachers asked about his day. The invisible man had become visible, not because he sought attention, but because his actions had demanded recognition. 6 months later, Lincoln High School dedicated a memorial garden to Edwin's service, both in Vietnam and at their school. The centerpiece was a simple bronze plaque that read, "In honor of Edwin Torres, who taught us that heroes walk among us, asking for nothing but the chance to serve." Edwin attended the dedication ceremony, standing quietly in the back as students and community members spoke about the impact he'd had on their lives. When they asked him to speak, he simply said, "Thank you for letting me be part of your story." But perhaps the most meaningful change was the one that couldn't be measured in ceremonies or plaques. Marcus Davidson, the young man who had come to Lincoln High School to commit murder, was now serving a 25-year sentence. But during his trial, he had asked to speak with Edwin. Their conversation, which took place in the county jail under heavy security, lasted 2 hours. Marcus apologized not just for what he'd tried to do, but for the pain he'd been carrying that had led him to that point. Edwin listened, offered forgiveness, and made a promise that surprised everyone involved. "When you get out," Edwin told the young man, "if you want to make things right, come find me. There's always work to be done helping people." Edwin Torres continued working at Lincoln High School until his retirement at age 70. By then, 3 graduating classes had grown up knowing his story, understanding that heroism comes in many forms, and that the most important battles are often fought by people who never seek recognition for fighting them. On his last day of work, Edwin cleaned the hallways one final time, checked all the doors, and saluted the flag in the main office, just as he had every day for 6 years. As he was preparing to leave, Jessica Martinez, now a senior, approached him with a gift. It was a photo album filled with pictures and notes from hundreds of students whose lives he'd touched. The final page contained a letter signed by every member of the graduating class. "Mr. Torres, you taught us that being a hero isn't about medals or recognition. It's about showing up every day, caring for others, and being ready to do what's right when the moment calls for it. Thank you for showing us how to live with courage, humility, and purpose. You'll always be our hero." Edwin Torres read the letter twice, then carefully placed it in his toolbox next to his old Vietnam service radio. Some things he'd learned were worth keeping forever. As he drove away from Lincoln High School for the last time, Edwin Torres reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from the jungles of Vietnam to the hallways of an American high school. He'd saved lives in both places, but more importantly, he'd learned that service never ends. It just takes different forms. The Medal of Honor certificate that had spent 50 years hidden in a basement was now displayed in the Lincoln High School trophy case, donated by Edwin as a reminder to future students that heroism is a choice available to everyone, every day. And if you asked Edwin Torres what he was most proud of, he wouldn't mention Vietnam, or medals, or stopping a school shooting. He'd tell you about the thank you notes from students, the way Jessica Martinez had found the confidence to stand up to bullies, and the fact that Lincoln High School felt like home to kids who might not have found that anywhere else. Because sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in enemies defeated, but in lives protected, futures preserved, and young people inspired to be better than they ever thought possible. Edwin Torres, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, school janitor, and everyday hero, had learned the most important lesson of all: true service is invisible until the moment it matters most.